This is the lecture for European history for Tuesday, the 25th of January 2021. We'll begin with the update to the syllabus, which you've just got. That update doesn't make big changes for you guys, except in what the case study is called. But I did want to make sure that you had on there everything that you needed. My ancient students needed a pretty a substantial rewrite. So I wanted to make sure that you had yours. The syllabi that are posted behind Pius and David in the back of the room have also been updated to what you have now. And there are copies of this on the classroom stream, the Google Classroom stream. So do you have any questions about the syllabus? I see none. Secondly, were there any thoughts that occurred to you after we were done with the discussion yesterday that relate to the discussion yesterday? Thought I'd ask. I see none. Where? Sam.
The first video we watched with
Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, he talked about, I think his third point on what Orwell got wrong is that people don't do it for power, they do it for utopianism.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for the top person who's in control of it, but I think people who are
the mid-management of the bureaucracies of evil. Yeah, many of them do it for the power. Beria, for example, is his reference. Beria was the head of the Soviet Gestapo, the NKVD, which is also known as GPU, GRU, and KGB. And he was a scheming, eminence grease, power-hungry sort of fellow. You're right. The bureaucrats of evil often do it for the power. But the real fulcrum people, the people whose ideas change the world and whose actions affect the fate of millions, they often are driven by something more than simply careerism.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that most revolutionaries who succeed at taking over a country bemoan and decry is that there are too many careerists entering the ranks of the revolutionary government. They're interested in getting promoted and in having a pension, not in making a better world, whereas the real revolutionaries wanted to make a better world. So, good point. Now, unless that brought up any other things from yesterday, before we go into today, it seems reasonable to discuss the Ukraine. Because major world news is possibly in the offing. So I'm going to give you a brief, quick and dirty history of this region. Physically, the Ukraine is the area north of the Black Sea. It includes the Crimean Peninsula and the grasslands between the Don River in the east, the Donets River, and the Dnieper River, all the way to what historically had been called Bessarabia and today is called Moldova. The Poles, because there are no natural frontiers, claimed, when Poland-Lithuania was great, claimed the Ukraine. And in the late 1700s, Tsarina Catherine the Great organized the conquest of the Ukraine from the Tatars, the Mongols that ruled that region. And then, basically around the time of the American Revolution, from that point, Russia dominated the Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians and Russians share much in common. They're both Slavic peoples. They both are Eastern Orthodox Christians. The Russians call Ukrainians Little Russians. The Ukrainians don't. Just as they call the people to their west White Russians. The people of what is today Belarusia or Belarus. Ukrainians consider themselves to be a distinct, separate Slavic people. Russians consider them to be an adjunct of the Russian people. In fact, the first civilization in Russia was around Kiev, the Kievan Rus, which is the Bogatirs, the Viking-type settlements that we talked about when we discussed the historical myth of Baba Yaga, the witch who's walks on giant chicken legs, the witch who eats children. So there is a historical connection between the Ukraine and Russia. Now, at the end of World War I, as Russia was beset by the fall of the Tsar, the invasion of the Germans, and the revolutions, both in March, that was a liberal revolution, and then in November, that was a communist revolution, the Russians lost their grip on the Ukraine. And there were no less than 6 separate Ukrainian governments in about 3 years during the period of the Russian Civil War. All of them failed, and the Soviets reclaimed the Ukraine for Russia, was then called the Soviet Union, in the early 1920s. During World War II, Russians used to joke about using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder. For example, if there was a potential minefield ahead, send the Ukrainians ahead. And if they start blowing up, well, there's a minefield, send the Russians around. If there's not, then send the Russians through. And the Ukrainians understood that this was the case, but there was nothing they could do about it. The Ukrainian spirit, to the extent that there was one, had been broken by Stalin in 1929, 1930, 1931 by a man-made famine that killed about 30 million people. A man-made famine created by Stalin's policy of forced collectivization and the confiscation of food from farms. So the function that the Ukraine served within the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union was as a breadbasket. The Ukraine has incredibly fertile soil. It's the Iowa of Western Asia, northwestern Asia. It is a place where wheat and vegetables just grow if you have good farmers. And the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Jews that were there before World War II were all good farmers. So the Ukraine served an important role. When the Soviets fell in the early 1990s, a number of nationalities that had been under Russian and Soviet dominion broke free. In Central Asia, you've got the various stans. You've got Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. You have Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Caucasian republics. You have Belarus and Moldova, and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Finland had broken away at the end of World War I, and Poland had finally broken the shackles of communism, all when the Soviets fell. But the greatest area that was lost territorially to what became the Russian Federation is the Ukraine. The Ukraine is massive, and it includes the Crimean Peninsula, which dangles southward into the Red Sea, or into the Black Sea. Throughout the 1990s, the Russians were ruled by an old alcoholic, but somewhat friendly and genuinely committed to some kind of democracy, president named Boris Yeltsin. But a KGB colonel named Vladimir Putin took over in around just before the year 2000. Now, the KGB, again, was the Soviet Gestapo. It was their political secret police. You do not retire from the KGB. You simply are given fewer active duty missions. So the worldview of Vladimir Putin was consistent with the Soviet worldview, which was a combination of National Socialism, Russian nationalism, and Communist socialism. And since that time, for over 20 years, between 20 and 25 years, Putin has created a authoritarian dictatorship. Not a communist police state, not a totalitarian dictatorship like George Orwell, but authoritarian. He's a dictator. And about 10 years ago, give or take, there was an opportunity. Putin sensed weakness in President Barack Obama. So, one of the things he did to test Obama was move troops into Armenia and then move them out almost immediately to see if there would be an American response. There was talk, but no action. And then Putin moved Russian forces and took the Crimean Peninsula from the Ukraine. It is still officially a part of the Ukraine, but Russia has ruled Sevastopol and the Crimean Peninsula for over 10 years. And during the time since the seizure of the Crimea, which was met by chatter talk, diplomacy talk, economic sanctions talk, blah, 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 no action, Putin has moved Russian forces into the eastern Ukraine. And that area has effectively, even though it's officially still part of the Ukraine, become part of Russia, the Russian Federation. Now, and this is not a political statement, you know that I am not a fan of the current president. This is a geopolitical assessment. Whether rightly or wrongly, our enemies around the world perceive weakness in the Biden administration. They perceive it because President Biden seems to be old, out of touch, a bit like Yeltsin was in the 90s, a man who simply was too old to shoulder the burdens of active leadership. But also, philosophically, Biden has not been a pro-American interventionist. He's not been from that school of thought. So Putin sees an opportunity. So do the Chinese, so do the Iranians, so do the North Koreans. And for the last few months, Putin has moved several 100,000 troops. I'll say that again, several 100,000 troops. This is real army numbers, not fake, little war army numbers, into the eastern Ukraine and around the borders of the Ukraine with the intent of threatening it and possibly conquering it. Last week, President Biden made one of the biggest gaffes I've ever seen an American president make. I'll make an analogy. In mid-1950, American Secretary of State Dean Acheson, during the early Cold War period, was on a Far East Asia trip, and he spoke about America's areas of interest in the Far East. And he mistakenly left out South Korea. He listed everywhere else, but not South Korea. North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung took this speech to Moscow and convinced Joe Stalin that the Americans wouldn't fight over South Korea, and that was an indication that the Americans wouldn't fight. Fewer than 2 months later, North Korean troops were deep inside South Korea, pushing to the sea to drive the South Koreans and their American allies off the mainland of Asia. They failed, because in fact we proved we were willing to fight. Last week, in a press conference, President Biden casually answered that it may be inevitable that Putin will take over Ukraine. He also opined that there would be a difference between a minor incursion and a full-scale invasion. Well, understand that diplomacy is a word game. It's a shell game played with words. It is incredibly likely that if Putin pulls the trigger on this and sends the troops in, he won't conquer the Ukraine in the old style and simply expand Russia's border to the Black Sea. What he'll do is appoint a stooge, puppet president of Ukraine, who will basically do Moscow's will. He'll say that he restored the Ukraine to its true independent state and gave it back a real government, a government completely servile to Putin's interests. And he'll leave that lie in front of the world to see what the world does with it. It's a lot like a wife who's been caught in flagrante delicto with the pool boy by her early home arriving husband, who says, "Honey, you don't understand. We were just having a tickle fight. It was nothing serious. Who are you going to believe, me or your eyes?" Everyone in that room knows if you believe your eyes, the marriage is over, everything changes, life becomes hard, and I'm going to fight you in a harsh divorce settlement. Even if I lose, you will pay. On the other hand, if you accept the convenient lie, I'll owe you. You'll get your way in a bunch of arguments and upcoming fights. The world will be invited to take part in the lie. That the Ukraine was liberated by Russian troops and is now a newly independent state that just happens to align with Russian interests. Now, there was a test case 2 weeks ago that you've probably not even heard about. Kazakhstan's long-standing dictator died a couple years ago. Since then, his heirs have tried to rule in his stead, but they didn't have his particular viciousness. So the people were rising up and taking to the streets, saying that we want an actual government that's free. So the successors of the dictator asked for Russian intervention to stabilize the situation. And so Russian troops invaded Kazakhstan 2 weeks ago. Again, you've probably not even heard this. And the successors of the dictator have been shored up by Putin. And we haven't gone peace. It's not a good sign. That's, I think, in its own way as bad as Biden's gaffe at the press conference. I assume it's a gaffe. Here's what's at stake. Since 1945, the peace of the world has been maintained. You may say, but there have been wars since 1945. Yeah, minor wars, mid-sized wars. Wars like the war in Panama, or the war in Grenada, or the war in Vietnam or Korea. Those are small and mid-sized wars. These are not wars involving major industrial powers, first world countries with atomic weapons fighting one another. And part of the reason for that is with the decline and fall of the British Empire, the United States has stepped up as the world's policeman. Most Americans don't like this role, but we felt we've carried the burden of it. During the Cold War, we guided and protected the free world from Soviet communism. Since the Cold War, we have extended our role into formerly communist areas. Aggressors know that if they cross a border with the intent to conquer, they plausibly might, be facing American military force. And ultimately, American military force is backed up by our atomic deterrent. We chose to accept defeat in Vietnam. We chose to accept a tie in Korea. We chose, under this president, to accept a humiliating retreat from Afghanistan. We didn't have to do any of those things. We have military force sufficient to conquer almost any foe. Without the inclusion of Russia or China, they would be much more difficult, or India. But in the end, if we really wanted to, we could flatten an entire country and turn it into a glassed-over radioactive desert. American military force has deterred aggressors and kept a relative peace for generations. And during that time, the population of the world has blossomed. If Russia is allowed to absorb the Ukraine and get away with it, there is nothing that will hold the Iranians back from going after Israel, or the North Koreans from going after South Korea, or the Chinese from going after Taiwan, or even Japan. The plausible threat of American force will be revealed to be what Mao Zedong once called a paper tiger, an illusion. So as much as I don't want a war, it may be necessary to preserve a greater peace. President Biden has blown hot and cold on this. He's activated American military forces and moved them towards Central and Eastern Europe as almost a tripwire force. I'm not sure that's the wisest of moves, but I understand it, and part of me agrees. If we allow aggression, we encourage it elsewhere, and the peace of the world comes crumbling down as tin pot dictators try to take more and more territory. It's the 1930s all over again. Another possibility, though, is that we intervene and lose. America decides to step up, but our allies don't, and the American people don't really back it, and we do a half-hearted effort that ends in a humiliation. Well, that also eliminates the American deterrent. We reveal ourselves to be useless. to our allies. And our allies will go bye-bye, because politics is the art of the possible. And pragmatic politicians, no matter where they are, will abandon a weak ally for a strong one. And the Western and Central Europeans are compromised. Europe relies on nuclear power more than the United States. But to supplement that nuclear power, it has stopped using its massive coal reserves because coal seems dirty. And instead has embraced the use of natural gas. Piped by pipeline from Russia. During the Trump administration, we tried to encourage the Europeans to transition their natural gas purchases from Russian pipelines to American tankers filled with liquefied natural gas. The Europeans were not interested because it would be more expensive, even though it placed them at the mercy of Vladimir Putin. It's wintertime in Europe because, like us, they're in the Northern Hemisphere. And if the Europeans make too much trouble for the Russians, they don't have to do much to Europe. All they have to do is turn off the spigots. No more natural gas from Russia. And the economies of Western and Central Europe will grind to a halt. Everyone knows it. So if Putin pushes things in the Ukraine, one of the realities is that Europe, which American action would be intended to defend and protect from a continuing Russian aggression, might stab us in the back for the sake of keeping the gas flowing. And it's not just about Ukraine. It's about Israel. It's about Taiwan. It's about the peace of the world. So am I saying, oh my God, we're all going to die? Well, yeah, eventually we will. That's a natural thing. I am not saying we're on the verge of Armageddon any more than usual. One of the realities of adulthood is that you realize that there are no training wheels and there are no guardrails. Life is always dangerous. This is a moment of danger. If Putin gets away with it, the people in Beijing will not be deterred by us. Now, the Russians have something in their favor that might keep the peace. Even though most of the people who lived through the Great Patriotic War, what they call World War II, are dead now, Russia still bears the scars of over 30 million dead at the hands of the Nazis and of Stalin during the war. The Russian people have a visceral, deep memory of how horrible a real war is. That helped keep the peace during the Cold War. The leadership of the Kremlin, the palace in Moscow from which the Russian government rules its domain, had all had personal experience fighting in World War II. They did not want another war. Putin's people have this memory. It might keep them from actually pulling the trigger. I hope it does. What scares me is that the people in Beijing who run China have no memory like that. And their only experience is bullying their captive population. That disturbs me. So, relax. There's nothing you can do about it except pray and hope and understand that it's not abnormal for the world to be on the brink. It's a normal thing. We've actually had a remarkably peaceful time since the fall of the Soviets, even including the global war on terror, which was a small-scale war. This is normal. Usually every couple of years it happened when I was growing up. The Soviets and the Americans would have a Mexican standoff, like two gunfighters in the middle of an old Wild West street, staring into each other's eyes, ready to draw, ready to shoot, ready to kill, ready to die. And during those periods, both sides found a way to live. The downside is the end of the 1968 movie Planet of the Apes. I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's one of the great movies of the 20th century. But I think Charlton Heston's final words in that movie are the most eloquent cry of anguish about the possibility of nuclear war I've ever heard. And any sane person would want to avoid that. So there's my quick and dirty history. It's not perfect. It's not nuanced. Remember, I wrote my college senior thesis on the Russian Civil War. I do know quite a bit about Russian history. But I've given you a quick and superficial picture. Do you have any questions, comments, or thoughts? Sir?
I feel like that what the Biden administration's stance on war so far throughout their term has kind of put them into a corner in terms of what they can do, and them only really having one or two good outcomes from this, which requires some very specific things to happen. Because so far their stance on war has been, war bad, no. So like they pulled out of Afghanistan, like they just yanked it out of Afghanistan, like pulling someone's hair out. But then they also still stuff going on in Africa, stuff going on in Syria that they're kind of just like keeping down. And now with what's going on in the Ukraine, you have Russia being aggressive towards the Ukraine, and a lot of Americans I don't think are going to want to support a war in Ukraine. Like, I mean, I wouldn't support a war in Ukraine. I'd support the troops.
Unless it was explained to you why it was a necessity.
I understand why it's necessary, but with the current administration, I don't realize that if they do start or go the war in Ukraine, that they're not going to do it right. Which I will support the troops that are there, but I'm not going to support the administration.
I understand what you just said very, very well, and it's a concern of mine.
Yeah, okay. Because like we do have troops in Ukraine. It's not like conventional troops. We have some special operations guys in there, like Green Berets from the 10th Special Forces Group. They're in there.
Well, we also have the Marine Guards at our embassy.
Yeah, there's the Marine guys at the embassy, but like 10th Special Forces Group, they're in there doing their thing. Green Berets training up Department forces, blah 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 blah. But if the Biden administration commits conventional troops to that theater of operations, their track record, and so far the track record of past governments so far is our troops are going to be one hand tied behind their back. And if we go to fight that conventional war, then it's just going to go downhill.
The fear is that they won't stop with Ukraine, that Russia will then march into Poland. We're not going to allow that. Or the Baltic states. We are absolutely not going to allow that. Ukraine has always been in this gray area. And unfortunately, this gray area encourages the sorts of things Putin has been doing.
Yeah, it's not like, and this is like a totally different kind of threat, if you want to look at it like that, because it's not like it's a something small, comparatively. Where it's
Ukraine is huge.
Well, no, where it's like, it's Greece and Turkey going at each other like they do every once in a while. It's not like we can say, oh, hey, we have a couple carrier battle groups, so let's just go put one in the Aegean Sea and suddenly they calm down. If you do that with Russia, they're not going to care.
No.
They're going to be like, yeah, whatever, fine.
No, Russia is a warrior nation. It's not. Yeah. It's not Prussia. It's not the Mongols, but it has aspects of its own warrior tradition that are just as nasty and just as powerful and just as prideful. No, you're right. You gotta move on unless you have anything left to say. Okay. Jane.
It seems like Putin's kind of set up this entire situation possibly like a chessboard. Like he's a
very smart fellow.
He's an intelligent person, and he's managed to maintain power for so long without getting himself assassinated, shockingly. So part of me almost wonders if he's planned this for many, many years. Because there have been past events. I mean, was he in power during the Cold War? I don't know how long
he was a KGB colonel until the fall of the Soviets, and then he worked with various internal forces to become the effective leader of Russia, again, just before 2000.
All right.
But he remembers the Cold War.
Right. So and even there, he was kind of in a position of power, so he was able to learn from those officials.
Yeah.
And there are those amazing masterminds who can plan out events like 20 years into the future.
The Chinese claim that they can do that. They can't, but they claim they can. Anyway, go on.
Like, Caesar did quite a bit where he planned out what he was going to do to cause not necessarily trouble, but that's the best word I can find for the situation. So, I mean, part of me just wonders if that's what Putin's done.
Putin is certainly doing that. He's trying to. Whether he succeeds or not is an open question. Here's the elephant in the room that nobody has talked about, including me so far. The American military, unless we're willing to wage full-scale nuclear war, is not capable of simultaneously fighting a major war in Eastern Europe, in Western Pacific against China, and in the Middle East against Iran. We can fight one of those wars. We might even be able to do two. But we can't do all three. And what has been in the back of my mind for many years is if our enemies decide to roll the dice and do simultaneous war in all of those areas. Western Europe has allowed itself to become so useless in war that it'll take them a few years to spool up. And their culture is much more prone to surrender than it is to fight. In the world wars, the British always had us to fall back on. We don't have anyone like that. The Australians are weaker than us, and they're infiltrated by the Chinese. The Indians have their own interests. We may be allies for a while, but no, it's a tough situation. And if we are still in a very good position, but we have to play our cards right. And I don't think we are. At least I wonder if we're not. No, you're right. There is a gamesmanship about this.
Currently it seems like we're almost in the check position for chess. Like, there is a way to get out of it, potentially. However, if you make the wrong move, you're going to end up in check.
Yeah. And part of the whole brinksmanship thing is you have to be willing to draw and shoot. There's no question in people's minds. The former president, Trump, was willing to draw and shoot. I don't know about this guy, and neither does anyone else. And that is a problem. Yes.
I mean, there's always the chance that Biden's considered everything that we're talking about and said, well, we can't fight all these wars on our own, so that means we need to get the rest of the world on board with what we're doing. There's always the chance that he thought that through and said, okay, well...
There's always the chance.
The world doesn't care about Ukraine and Taiwan and all those smaller things, so the only thing that's really going to wake them up out of their stupor is if some mainstream country gets invaded. And so maybe he's considered that and said, okay, we'll let Ukraine and Taiwan get invaded, but as soon as something that would be a catalyst.
Okay, here's an answer to that. The answer is the Munich Conference in 1938. Throughout 1938, Hitler had been demanding the Sudetenland, a mountainous shield protecting Czechoslovakia, because there was a German minority there, and Hitler claimed they were being abused, which is baloney. And Hitler was getting ready to invade. And the Czechs said, bite me, we have mountains, we have a really good defense system, and the British and French are obliged by treaty to come to our aid, and even the Soviet Union is promising to go to war with Germany if you attack us. So the world in September of 1938 is face to face with the beginning of a Second World War, which is a terrifying prospect. I'm telling you, it's as terrifying as a war would be to start today. So the British Prime Minister, a genuine man of peace, who I think is one of the worst leaders in human history, Neville Chamberlain, but a genuine man of peace, gets on a plane and goes to Germany and negotiates the Munich Agreement. At the Munich Agreement, I'll go into more detail about this when we cover it. At the Munich Agreement, in September 1938, Chamberlain agrees to give away the Sudetenland. He agrees to betray his ally, which he is obliged by treaty to defend, in return for Germany promising, this is my last territorial demand. So Chamberlain backstabs the Czechs. The French go along with Chamberlain because they're desperate not to be left alone on the continent with Germany. And the Russians say, you Westerners are a bunch of cowards. And within a year, Hitler and Stalin arrange an agreement where Russia becomes Germany's ally, which is what starts World War II. Because Chamberlain kept the peace. There is a part of me that's afraid that Biden will find a way to keep the peace without it seeming like Russia's gotten away with murder and conquest, but that it actually will be like a modern Munich Agreement, and that the peace will create a much worse war very soon. Had the world gone to war in September of 1938, Germany would have been alone against 5 or 6 major powers. And they would have been attacking through the mountains of Czechoslovakia, which is not a good prospect, even for... And at the same time, there's a year of peace, and then Germany's able to start a war where it conquers Poland, conquers France, and conquers everything from the Pyrenees border with Spain all the way to the suburbs of Moscow in just a couple of years. So there's a risk of us keeping the peace in the short term but setting ourselves up in the long term for a much worse war. We don't know any of that. It's part of the existential doubt that is adult life.
What I meant is that maybe he had anticipated the politics in these Western European, European countries, and said, okay, well, we'll wait until one of the bigger countries gets attacked, and then everybody will be on.
Maybe you're right. In fact, part of me hopes that Biden is that calculating strategist. Unfortunately, I've watched Biden since the 70s, and this is a guy who was for the nuclear freeze. I'm not going to go on. I don't think Biden's the guy, but maybe he has somebody like that with him. Maybe. We can hope. Because otherwise, if we don't have his strategery, we're up a torsional inclined plane. Yes. Do you have one more thing? Okay, yes.
Yeah, so going back
and be brief, please, because I got to do things.
Yeah, going back to the not being able to fight multiple wars at the same time, like the American military, just at the core, is not designed to fight multiple large-scale wars. The American military is just built up all these different, like, major units, but just self-contained units that handle a certain section of the globe, like PACOM, Pacific Command, AFRICOM. They're not designed or made to interact with each other to be able to fight those multiple wars, because even within those self-contained units, more self-contained units, they're really, honestly, on a large scale, are small.
We're designed to fight colonial wars, what the British used to call colonial wars. We keep the peace.
We're an expeditionary fighting force. Like, we're not designed to go out and go fight war with Russia, go fight a war with China, go fight a war with Iran.
Go on.
Because, like, if we did do that, on the Pacific front, it'd be a total defensive war. On the Iranian front, we'd probably just be hanging out in Israel, helping them shoot down missiles the entire time. And the only actual offensive war, would be in Russia. But even then, it's not advisable to go offensive over there.
Well, the Indians and the Japanese would be helping us in Asia. I don't think we'd be purely on defense. But I do think the Chinese are eager to sink a couple of American carrier groups.
They can try.
They can try, and with hypersonic missiles, they might succeed. Also, we haven't protected our power grid from EMP attacks. So you could end up with an atomic attack that doesn't kill people, but just directly, but blanks out all civilian electronics, in which case we're going to have tens of millions of deaths anyway, because our society is not designed to operate without electricity anymore. There are all sorts of nightmare scenarios. You're right. But I think the worst thing about our military is an attitude. And this is in the leadership. It's not so much in the troops. The attitude is that it would be almost unimaginable for the Pentagon to authorize 1945-style rules of engagement. And that's what needs to happen in any real war, which is you use anything, up to maybe tactical nukes and chemical weapons and biological weapons. But you've got an enemy area that's in a built-up city and they're hiding behind their own civilians. Flatten it with artillery or bombers. Send people in to take the rubble. That's what we would do in 45. But since 45, we don't do that very often. Since Vietnam, we haven't done it really at all. And if you're not willing to kill in war and be brutal, you're not going to win. That's a dark truth. And our military tries to be the white-hatted cowboy too much. And we therefore, anyway, I live in hope. Thank you for taking part, and I hope it was informative. Ask questions, come to your own conclusions. Does anyone have anything else they wish to say? Especially if you think that I've been prejudiced in any way. If you do, tell.
No, I just have a question. So you said that they're like kind of deciding what to do with this whole situation?
Yeah.
Did they say like they were going to have like a meeting about it at some point, or?
Putin is poised to move his troops in at any moment. And he hasn't yet. I think he's assessing the situation. And I think what we're trying to do is create every signal that we can. If we were an animal that had plumage, we'd be doing what peacocks do to try to indicate, don't do this, it's going to end badly. But he has to decide. Really, guns in his hand, his fingers on the trigger. He or the people around him are going to have to make that decision. I hope they make the right. Okay. So, you know, the early industrial period is traumatic. To understand communism, there's a Star Trek quote that explains the ideal of it. The ideal of communism or of socialism is, from each according to his ability, well, actually, the Star Trek quote is, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So the Star Trek quote, which you can write if you choose to, is, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That is a chilling thought. And as a younger Star Trek fan, when I first heard Spock say that, I was like, that makes sense. And later it was like, oh my God, that's communism! The needs of the many require everyone to get masked or vaxxed, or everyone to get a chip in them, or the needs of the many? The needs of the many have been the excuse of dictators and tyrants for centuries. But it seems to make sense, because that way you take care of the needs of society. The individual is subsumed into the needs of society. What Lenin says in his book, What is to be Done, which is a paraphrase of Leo Tolstoy's What Then Must We Do, is this. And this is another way of describing the ideal of communism. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This is almost Plato Republic stuff. What you have is a society where natural musicians become players in an orchestra, where natural mathematicians become engineers, where natural ditch diggers dig ditches. Everyone finds in their education system what their talents are. And then you give of your talents out of a sense of public virtue and generosity and mutual need and common weal. And you only take what you need. So we're all sharing. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about us. Us. From each according to his abilities. We give. We work. We work for the common good. We work to better ourselves. To each according to his needs. Now, do you need to have a car? Let alone a new car with air conditioning and a nice music system or computer system in it? No. You don't need to. Nobody needs to have a car unless they are a taxi driver or an Uber driver. What do you need? Who decides what you need? Do you need a vacation? Do you need more than vegetarian vegan food? What do you need? It's an us decision, not a you decision, not a me decision. So in the name of collectivism, the ideal socialistic utopia is a place where people give according to their abilities and take only according to their needs, whatever the hell that means, their needs. But do you see the appeal of it? No poverty, no want, no oppression, except that of the collective over the individual. Everyone's cared for. Caring is sharing. Everything is shared in common. There is no property. There is no attempt of ape-descended primitives to claim the earth. It's all ours. And all we have to do is be wise enough to rise above our animal instincts of acquisition and greed and take in hand our brother. The truth is, Marxism and socialism and communism could not have come from anywhere but a Judeo-Christian set of values. Because the traditional societies of Asia and elsewhere in the Middle East do not value everyday common people the way Judeo-Christian society does. And if you have a Judeo-Christian mindset, and you accept that all human beings are precious and valuable, then if you are logical and ignore context and consequence, if you are simply following a logical equation, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, then you must be a socialist. Because if you believe the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, then the desire for accomplishment or achievement or excellence are luxuries, as much of a luxury as a house kept at 72 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, by heat and by air conditioning. It's a luxury that no one needs. What people need is to be fed. They need to have education. They need to have the dignity of work. They need to be belonging. They need to be in a society ruled by the elite, by the best and the brightest. So socialism actually postulates a version of Plato's Republic, where those who are destined to rule, rule, where those who are destined to serve, serve, but that service is rewarded by the best communal lifestyle in human history. No one dies hungry on the street, alone, drug addict, beaten. A world without greed. Because to live in this world, what you need to have is not just a new human society, you need a new human nature. Our very nature, which if you accept Darwin, which Marx implicitly does, our nature has been violent. The 2001 A Space Odyssey idea that it was our ability to learn to kill with a club that brought us from the state of animals in East Africa to space stations and moon bases. But if we don't overcome that very thing that made us great, that violence, that beast within, the greed, the desire to acquire, the desire to conquer, the will to power, which what Nietzsche and Hitler called it, if you don't overcome that, you destroy the world. If you do overcome it, you get all the benefits that have come from civilization up to this point, and then you live in the New Jerusalem, a paradisical world where everyone gets what their just desserts are. If you are the kind of person that likes to work outdoors and ride, you become a cowboy. If you are the kind of person that likes making colorful blotches on canvas, you become an artist. Maybe everyone has to work in the latrines from time to time just to make, do your civic duty. Instead of paying taxes, you pay labor. But it's an ideal picture of life with a new kind of person to live in. That's what they're selling. They're selling the capacity of human beings to build heaven on earth. And it is that vision that so many socialists and communists of various stripes are willing to kill for, die for, or live for. I will also say that Communist Labor Day is coming up. It's May 1st, May Day. Americans are very clear in our anti-communism in that we decided to celebrate Labor Day at the end of the summer, just before school starts, or just around the time school starts. Labor Day around the world is May 1st, Labor Day. Communist Labor Day. Thank you. Come again.